In the eyes of the people living in the One Piece world, Gold Roger is the strongest person who's ever existed. This, however, is more than likely not true. This video will go over how there have been multiple characters in this story more powerful than Roger, and why characters like Joyboy and Imu have likely achieved power far greater than Roger, and that they might not be the only ones. A good place to start is by making one thing very clear. Roger actually was someone who was incredibly powerful. Roger might even have the single best known resume of any fighter in this series. To go down the list, the notable figures Roger has fought include Whitebeard, Monkey D. Garp, Rocksteady Sebek, Shiki, Kaido, Sengoku, and Kosuki Oden. This is essentially the who's who of some of the strongest figures in this story. Even though we haven't actually seen many of these fights, the few times we've witnessed Roger in action, he's lived up to his legendary reputation. He has been able to perform incredible feats like blow Oden away with one attack, shake an entire island with his Conqueror's Haki, as well as go through a 3-day long battle with the Whitebeard pirates. As impressive as all of this is, however, Roger's reputation completely supersedes these accomplishments, and it's clear that he has achieved an immortal legacy in the current One Piece era. This is seen when the Straw Hats encounter other legendary figures of the world such as Garp and Whitebeard during the story. Even though they're some of the strongest men in the world, these characters are considered to be legends simply because they were able to fight on par with Roger. This is actually a frequent thing that happens in the story, where people talk about Roger's strength being out of this world. While Roger is known mainly for his treasure and his title of Pirate King, he is also pretty universally known as the strongest fighter of all time. When people in the One Piece world talk about someone being absurdly powerful, they use Roger as their example. This also applies to many of the characters from Roger's era, who are surprisingly honest about Roger's power. When someone like Shiki claims that he could personally kill Roger, Sengoku quickly rebuttals him, saying that Roger would have beaten Shiki. Shiki himself might have also been exaggerating in this moment, as he after Roger's death inadvertently admits that he was inferior to him. When Shiki talks about the new pirate era with Whitebeard, he says that Roger was a wall that was holding both him and Whitebeard back, heavily implying that he considered Roger to be superior to both of them. Another notable character who believes that Roger when he was alive was the strongest is Kaido. Kaido believes that Roger proved how powerful Haki is by conquering the seas without the devil fruit. While there could be many ways of interpreting this line, for me, Kaido's message is clear. Roger became the absolute strongest with just Haki. This is a very noteworthy quote, as Kaido has personally fought most of the strongest characters of his time, and believed that he himself was the strongest being alive during the Wano arc. Yet, out of all the characters, he evoked the name of Roger to use as an example of ultimate power. There is also another pirate who actually lived through Roger's era that had even greater things to say about Roger. While not as infamous as Kaido, Don Jinchao was still a notable figure in the past. For example, Garp respected his strength enough to practice by destroying entire mountains before facing him. According to Jinchao, if someone in the current era wanted to surpass Roger's legacy, they would have to beat all of the 4 emperors as well as the 3 admirals. While a very grandiose claim, it is arguably accurate, as Roger in his life left behind a trail of destruction of some of the strongest fighters who'd ever lived, including figures who'd at one point or another become emperors and admirals. What's also noteworthy here is that people recognizing Roger as the strongest is not something that they do out of adoration. Roger is a figure who's actually hated by most people in the One Piece world, and many of the characters just mentioned were actually his rivals. Someone like Sengoku goes as far as calling Roger the greatest fiend the world has ever seen. Meanwhile, Kaido considered Roger to be a soft man, despite all of his power. There are also the regular civilians of the One Piece world, who hate Roger, and blame him for infesting the world with pirates because he started the Great Pirate Age. Yet, despite this bias, the world still by and large recognizes Roger as the strongest in history. However, none of this actually proves that Gol D Roger actually was the strongest character ever in this story. This is because of one simple thing. All the characters that were just mentioned, as well as the One Piece world at large, do not know the ancient characters who were and are stronger than Roger. This is because of the world government, who've done a very thorough job of wiping all records of the existence of these characters. Namely, The two characters in One Piece who more than likely are stronger than Roger are Joyboy and Imu. Or, perhaps a better way to describe these two is as the leaders of the two factions that tore the world apart in the Great War that took place during the Void Century. While the people of the current One Piece era do not know this, the world of One Piece was 900 to 800 years ago ravaged by a great war between the Ancient Kingdom and the allied forces of the 20 kingdoms that would later create the world government. There are several things in the story that indicate that Joyboy and Imu were figures far more powerful than Roger. Joyboy is someone who only a handful of characters in the current One Piece era know about, but those that do know him speak of Joyboy as if he was someone far above Gol D Roger. Notably, Roger himself talks of Joyboy in this way. When Roger finally reached the final island and discovered Joyboy's treasure, he says that he wished he'd lived in the same era as him. More importantly, however, after discovering that there's going to be a second coming of Joyboy in the future, Roger believes that this figure will surpass him. This sentiment is later echoed by both Oden and Kaido, who believe that the next Joyboy and his generation will surpass the last generation of the Emperors of the Sea. This build-up of Joyboy's power is rather warranted. According to Vegapunk, the reason why Imu had to unite 20 entire kingdoms against Joyboy was because that's just how powerful Joyboy's faction was. The fact that the war lasted for 100 years also means that Joyboy should be one of the most battle-hardened and experienced characters in the whole story. If the allied forces are anything like the world government of today, this could mean that Joyboy was for decades fighting characters who might have been on the level of the Five Elders or Navy Admirals, if not even stronger. It is also quite possible that Joyboy was the linchpin of the Ancient Kingdom's entire military. From what little history Vegapunk has read of the Great War, he brings up Joyboy as the central figure and main character of this conflict. According to Vegapunk, the event that also ended this war was the defeat of Joyboy, perhaps indicating that the war couldn't have been won if he wasn't dealt with. While still a very mysterious character, we actually do also have some evidence of Joyboy's personal combat ability. We know that he was the user of the Nika Devil Fruit, which he'd managed to awaken. The Five Elders refer to the ancient Nika fruit as the most ridiculous power in the world, and as we've seen with Luffy, the mere awakening of the fruit put him on a whole other level in his fight against Kaido. The fact that Joyboy had this fruit for potentially over a century, and that he frequently had to use it in combat during the Great War, paints a picture of an incredibly strong warrior, considering everything Luffy has managed to do after having only just awakened the fruit. We also know that there was even more to Joyboy than just his devil fruit. Namely, we've now seen that his haki was also extremely powerful. Before his death, Joyboy left a residual note of his Conqueror's haki with Emmet the robot, one of his followers. Centuries later, Emmet finally released this note during the Egghead arc, and the effects were some of the strongest Conqueror's haki seen in the entire story. The haki was actually strong enough to immediately dispel the transformations of the Five Elders. This is something that even some of the most powerful Conqueror's haki users we've seen are not capable of. For example, when Luffy first awakened the Nika fruit, he released Conqueror's haki so strong that it frightened Kaido, and made him think that someone other than Luffy must be doing it. However, Kaido still remained in his transformed state, despite being in close proximity to Luffy. Joyboy's Conqueror's haki blast on Egghead also managed to knock out all of the Vice Admirals in its vicinity. This is something that is once again rather unprecedented, as even some of the strongest characters in the story have difficulty knocking out anyone but very low-level characters with their Conqueror's haki. When Rayleigh used his Conquerors in the Sabodi auction house, characters like the pre-timeskip Heart Pirate still managed to stay conscious. When Big Mom activated her Conquerors during her tea party, while some of the guests were knocked out, even non-combatants like Pudding and Lufeld managed to stay conscious. Compared to this, Joyboy's Conqueror's haki was strong enough to knock out someone like Dole, who is not only a haki user able to destroy Mark III Pacifista, but is also the commander of one of the Navy's New World bases. Dorian Brokey noted just how powerful Joyboy's Conqueror's haki was, by saying that it might have been even stronger than Shanks's. What's also noteworthy is that Dorian Brokey had also just experienced Warcurry's Conqueror's haki, which was strong enough to shake an entire island. A feat that has only ever been done by Roger and Whitebeard in the story. Still, perhaps more impressive than all of this is that, somehow, Imu was able to sense Joyboy's presence through the haki, despite being half a world away in the Holy Land. I personally have no idea what could have happened here. In the story, We've seen characters like Enel, Shanks and Green Bull be able to use observation haki to sense people from several kilometers away. But Imu sensing Joyboy's haki on Egghead from the Holy Land is something completely new. Simply sensing the haki also made Imu scream. While Imu is extremely paranoid about anything related to the Void Century being revealed in the present day, he has always been very composed during these events. It's possible that Imu's reaction may have been of genuine fear and trauma of Joyboy's power. Based on this display of haki and the few things we know about him, Joyboy very much comes across as someone stronger than even Gol D Roger, and he could perhaps be the strongest character who's ever lived in the One Piece world. He might not, however, be the only one whose strength has surpassed the Pirate King. Of these ancient characters, not only Joyboy, but Imu is also someone likely stronger than Roger. While Joyboy's power has been built up by different characters, we've so far had zero references to Imu's strength. Despite this, it can be rather safely argued that Imu is someone right at the pinnacle of power right next to Joyboy. Many of the arguments that have been made about Joyboy can also be made about Imu. He's someone who also lived in the Void Century and participated in the Great War, and, like Joyboy, was seemingly the leader of his own faction. We also know that, despite him preferring to stay in the shadows, Imu is someone who can still get their hands dirty. When Sabo infiltrated Pangaea Castle during the reverie, he actually attacked Imu. The attack, however, had no effect on him, and we also saw that Imu is able to transform into a gigantic monster. While this is arguably not as bombastic as Joyboy's Conqueror's Haki blast on Egghead, it still tells us a few things about Imu. Sabo is the user of the Mera Mera no Mi, which is a devil fruit with a lot of offensive potential. In the canonical Ace novel, Ace managed to burn Whitebeard with the fruit, in a period of time before Whitebeard became ill. We've also seen the fruit do things like stop an attack from Aokichi and defeat one of Blackbeard's Titanic captains. Yet, the attack did seemingly nothing to Imu. While impressive, more than the actual feat, the important thing to note here is that this confirms that Imu is a fighter. The reason why this is so important is that it simultaneously pretty much confirms that Imu is by far and away the most experienced character in the history of the One Piece world. From what little we know, Imu is someone who's originally from the Void Century and has found a way to be immortal. This would mean that Imu is well over 800 years old, making him the oldest living One Piece character next to Shueisha. It could be that in all of these centuries, Imu has never stopped training his powers, and is currently far more powerful than he was even during the Great War against Joyboy. While actual combat is the best way to become stronger in the One Piece story, there are many characters who have also become many times stronger through pure training. The best example of this is probably the Straw Hat crew themselves. The Straw Hats spent their 2-year time skip doing nothing but training. As a result, someone like Luffy, for example, went from struggling with early versions of the Pacifista to fighting someone as strong as Doflamingo. Because Imu has had literal centuries of time in between the Void Century and the current story, he could have possibly become many times stronger now than in the past. It's also possible that Imu has actually been fighting in this period, in a manner of speaking. It could be that Imu has actually engaged with the 5 elders regularly in sparring in the confines of the Holy Land. The elders are all strong fighters in their own right, and they're some of the few people Imu actually trusts. If they did spar, it could explain why the elders are so strong and why some of them have scars, despite them almost never leaving the Holy Land. Because of all the time that he's had, it's possible that Imu has also discovered entirely new levels to devil fruit abilities, as he might be the one person in history who's had their fruit for the longest time. This goes back to a concept brought up all the way back in Alabasta, where Crocodile said that devil fruit abilities can be brought to a whole other level through training. Imu would actually parallel Crocodile a lot here. Just like Imu, Crocodile apparently spent years laying low in Alabasta and not fighting anyone of note. If Crocodile was able to bring his devil fruit to an entirely new level in these years, one can imagine what Imu has managed to do in the centuries he's had. Haki is also an ability that we've seen can be brought to an entirely new level through simple training. For example, someone like Sanji still had not unlocked Haki before the time skip, yet after training for 2 years, he achieved Haki strong enough to fight top Yonko officers. We've also seen that more advanced techniques of Haki can be mastered through just training. According to Capone, Katakuri was able to see the future with his observation haki purely because of training. In Wano, we also saw that Luffy mainly developed the skill to do internal damage with his haki through training under Hyogoro. Even if Imu has gotten a lot stronger in the past 800 years, however, there is one point that can be brought up against how strong he is currently. This is the fact that Imu was visibly frightened after Joyboy's power resurfaced in the present day on Egghead. Still, this surprisingly does not mean that Imu is weaker than Joyboy. In One Piece, just like in real life, trauma isn't straightforward evidence of you being weaker than someone else. The most notable example of this in One Piece is probably Kaido. Kaido has clear trauma of Kozuki Oden from fighting him 20 years ago. Kaido's trauma is so strong that he actually experiences it even when Oden's mere retainers attack him. This does not necessarily mean that Kaido is weaker than Oden, as he's had 20 years to grow after their fight. However, no matter how strong Kaido would have become, he still would have retained the memories of Oden in the past, almost beating him. Another example would be Blackbeard, who still gets frightened when seeing Rayleigh in the present day. Rayleigh himself admits that he could not beat Blackbeard in a fight, but for Blackbeard, the last time he encountered Rayleigh was when he was just a kid under the Whitebeard pirates. Trauma can also be something that is completely disconnected to one's strength as a fighter. Characters like Ace and Doflamingo still as adults suffered from how they were mistreated in their childhoods, even though the ones who mistreated them had been regular civilians. In the case of Imu, even if he is now far stronger than he was 800 years ago, he will likely still carry the memories of Joyboy's power for the rest of his life. This ironically makes Imu a more human character, despite everything he's done to make himself into something more. Yet, even if Imu underneath everything is still a human, he could still be the strongest character who is currently alive in One Piece. And he's probably held this status for hundreds of years before Luffy or Roger were even born. This would mean that, even though Roger in the current One Piece story is by far and wide seen as the strongest person in history, the key to his reputation lies in exactly that word, history. Based on what we know, Joyboy and Imu's strength more than likely far surpassed that of Gol D Roger, and the only reason why Roger has the reputation as the strongest is because both Joyboy and Imu have been wiped from history. This would mean that in both history and during the time when Roger was alive, he was never the strongest person in the One Piece world. However, what if there was actually even more to this topic? If you recall, at the beginning of the video, I said that there might be other characters in this story stronger than Roger, other than just Joyboy and Imu. While it's possible that figures like this existed during the Void Century, the characters I'm referring to actually lived in the same era as Roger. There's a genuine case to be made that Roger's greatest rivals, Whitebeard and Garp, were in their prime even stronger than Roger himself. This is admittedly a very unpopular take, and I myself have brought up evidence for why Roger was the strongest of these three men in this very video. However, there is actual evidence in the story that suggests that both Whitebeard and Garp may have actually in the end surpassed Roger. I would have liked to discuss this in this video, but I genuinely feel like the topic is different enough to warrant making a separate video. If the video is already uploaded, you can click here and watch it. If not, I'm trying to get the video out as soon as possible after this one. With that said, thanks for watching this video to the end.